Hello everyone, this is Tara at OmniTrax, welcoming you to today's webinar addressing your questions about the ELD mandate. There's a few housekeeping items that I should mention before we get started. You have joined in a muted conference mode, so please use the chat box to communicate with us. After the presentation, we will conduct a live Q&A, so please start typing your questions for the presenter whenever you have them. I should also mention that today's presentation is recording, and we'll provide that after the event, but we do encourage you to stay on until the end for the live Q&A. Joining us today is Tom Cuthbertson. Tom is VP of Regulatory Compliance at OmniTrax, and he has been in the industry for over 25 years as both a carrier and supplier. Tom has been involved with regulatory issues since 1996, and he works closely with FMCSA and CVSA Driver Traffic Safety Committee. He's currently chairman of the ATA Technology and Maintenance Council, ELD, and Connect the Vehicle Task Force. Since our webinar last month, Tom did go through your questions about the ELD mandate, and he'll be addressing them today. So Tom, let's get started.
Hi, thank you. Thanks very much. So I hope we've put a good agenda together for you with your questions. We'd like to get, when we looked at the questions, we came up with these topics that there was a lot more multiple questions around. And one would be, in the ELD mandate, they bring up the use of a yard move. And another question, we had multiple questions on the short haul as it related to the mandate, and we were going to discuss how OmniTrax and XRS products are going to address this. Some things I wanted to come back in again about was editing and other related items that for the driver would address harassment, or what FMCSA has put into the ELD SMPRM to address harassment. There were quite a few questions about adverse conditions and the 16-hour short haul exemption in that last webinar that we had. I want to talk about things that are in there, and there was many questions related to yard move about when does drive start, and I'll go over that and how it is in the SMPRM. And we may review, if we have time, some other related questions that seem to pop up through the queries that we got from the last webinar. So last time we put this glossary together, and it seemed to help people because I unfortunately may have a tendency to be so used to these buzzwords, I say them all the time. But under the current regulation, we have an EOBRD, which is an automatic onboard recording device. DOT, you'll hear Department of Transportation. What ELD means is electronic logging device. We still talk about an EOBR because it's the term that was interjected when the 395.16 was vacated. But an EOBR is electronic onboard device, but really as we're going forward, we're going to focus on this ELD electronic device. FIPS is a security method and security standards that the Federal Information Processing Standards publishes, and that's referenced in the regulation. FMCSA, I think many of you know, is Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. We talk about HOS all the time as hours of service. NPRM, Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, which is not the stage we're in at this time. NIST is another standards group that defines security and methods of security that we would have to implement with an ELD mandate. And PKI is a way to have encryption and have specific keys that have encrypted certificates so that the data would be totally protected for the driver and for the carrier. Record of duty status is something that a lot of people in the industry are aware of. And SMPRM is the supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking. A couple other buzzwords you may hear me talk about are things that we should have included. It's my fault, but OST was Office of Secretary of Transportation. And OMB you may hear, but that's the Office of Management and Budget. And the reason I mention those two, that, you know, given today being June 17th, on Monday, an updated timeline on the ELD mandate was published. Now, it didn't change anything, but what it did do is it gave an update that the SNPRM, the regulation, was actually given to the Office of the Secretary of Transportation, or OST. Now, what that means in this timeline is that things are moving in the direction that represents this timeline for a early fall, late, early October release of the SMPR or the final rulemaking on ELD mandates. Now, the reason that the trigger is important for the regulation to be at the Office of the Secretary of Transportation is that in the schedule that they published on Monday, which was the 15th, it also had a date, a forecasted date, not a final date, but a forecasted date that the regulation should be delivered to the Office of Management and Budget, which is the stop before it becomes a final rule. So if it does get released to the Office of Management and Budget this week, then it's another trigger mechanism that says that this thing is still on schedule to most likely be released by September or early fall. And I never bet money on these things because they are going through government processes. But what we have is, and nothing's changed that we know of, right, is that there's still a grandfather clause. So if you look at this blue line, that's really depicting that you can use an EOBRD if it's installed before the compliance date, which is 2 years after the published date, that you would be able to use an EOBRD 2 years later. So in the simulated timeline, that would mean October of 2019. So the first thing we wanted to cover was under the SMPRM, they put a new event, and it works kind of like a duty status called a yard move. So the driver puts themselves manually into this yard move. And what happens under this yard move is that the record of duty status is only going to show the yard move as on duty time, and it will not show it as drive time. So I think FMCSA did a good job here in thinking that, there's no benefit of counting every minute of drive like in the current regulation when you're in a yard. And we will be recording motion in the background, but it's not reportable in hours of service. So the one thing that we made some comments on and requested guidance is, think of this as an operational item also. That if a driver forgets to go to an on-duty status when leaving the yard, right, from a yard move, we requested guidance for clarification on how this should be treated. So that I believe would be fairly important to people to understand that in operations mode. So there was quite a few questions on short haul. So in the ELD SMPRM, it does not require short haul drivers to use an ELD, as it said. They made some comments and suggestions in the preamble, but the final regulation proposed language did not say that short haul would now have to use an ELD. So as you may or may not know, a short haul exemption, it does not require maintaining records of duty status. What's in the short haul exemption is you must start and return from the same location in 12 hours of duty. You can't drive any more than 11 hours. That's not part of the exemption. You must have at least 10 hours consecutive hours off between shifts. You need to employ a time clock function so you can justify that a person came on duty and went off duty within 12 hours. And for CDL drivers, is what we're talking about here, is it cannot exceed a 100-mile radius from a starting location or 115 statute miles. Now, some other things we've done, within this to try and help carriers use their devices easier is Omnitracs and XRS, as we're implementing short haul, and it's been released in the XRS product, and it will be released in MCP product. But it'll allow the driver to have alerts on every item of exception. So if let's just say that they didn't do the 12 hours and they went to the 13th hour of duty time, well, that means you have to go over the record of duty status, right? We already have this on the XRS product and will be on MCP. We're going to maintain the time clock at the mobile and the back office so that the driver has an idea of how much time they've expended to their 12 hours of duty. And what it also did is guidances came out on this for short haul exemption on how you needed to treat the 30-minute break should they break the short haul exemption rules. So that, in paraphrasing it, what it really says in the guidance is that if you break short haul exemption before the 8th hour of on duty, that you need to take your 30-minute break before you drive after that 8th hour. So we've comprehended that. It also says that if you broke the short haul exemption after the 8th hour, you need to take the 30-minute break prior to the 14th hour of duty and give a comment as why you didn't take it. So it shouldn't be a penalty to you unless you don't take the 30-minute break at the end of the 14th hour. We maintain drive and on duty and off in the background so that if something happens where the driver needs to go over the record of duty statuses, that all information is there. And we're also measuring all the criteria that's required for the 16-hour short haul exemption. So I also wanted to cover here, as I said, things for drivers that address harassment. We've covered this before, but I keep getting questions about it. So it really allows the driver to do full edits of their logs and create annotations, all entries, and edits. And when I say it's really not drive time, they can extend drive time, they can't reduce drive time. So drivers must approve all edits from the support system. So if you're operationally made edits at the back office and push those edits down to the driver, they're in a pending state until the driver accepts those edits and applies them to the log. And all drivers must have direct access to log information through the ELD, and it could also be on a web access, but that's to give them so they can get hard copies of their log detail. Ensure driver reviews all edits before they're applied and allows rejection. So that's pretty important. Several other things get into personal conveyance. We can't record too much detailed information. The GPS can't be any more fine than 10-mile accuracy, while in personal conveyance. Audible muting of any device by the driver so it doesn't disturb sleep, and that regulation for coercion of prohibition of it is still there. And coercion means that if a dispatcher, a broker, a carrier, or a shipper coerce the driver to modify their logs to make them non-compliant or make them change logs, that the driver has the right to bring that to someone's attention. The other one is that if there's any unassigned vehicle moves in the vehicle that the driver comes into and logs onto, that they are to be presented to the driver for them to apply them and get the reconciliation that way. And if they're rejected, then it's the responsibility of the carrier. Now, on a 16-hour exemption, as I talk to customers and, even other people, sometimes there's not a good understanding of that. There's multiple criteria to be able to use this. So the 16-hour exemption gives an additional 2 hours of duty time. It doesn't extend drive time. It only extends 2 hours of duty time to allow the driver to have those days where they're running out of duty because of stops are extended or something like this. It can only be used once in a 7-day cycle. So basically that is the current day plus the previous 6. The driver must begin and end at the same location and be dismissed by the 16-hour on the day that they use a 16-hour exemption. They must begin and end at the same location for the 5 previous tours of duty or 5 previous cycles. So that's pretty important. So that means the day you use it plus the 5 previous, you have to be coming and going from the same location. And it must be preceded by a 10-hour consecutive off-duty. So if you had 8 hours off-duty and you wanted to implement this, wouldn't work. And when using while in short haul, it must be with record of duty status. So even if you're in a short haul exemption and you're using short haul rule set, that doesn't require record of duty statuses. So if that day the driver decides or needs the benefit of a 16-hour exemption, that day you must keep record of duty status. one thing that comes up, and I get emails on this, I would suggest 3 times a month, maybe 5, in that range. And we had quite a few questions on different pieces of this. So I'm going to give you what it says in the regulation here and give you maybe a little bit of interpretation on how it's looked at. But in the regulation, it talks about snow, sleet, fog, or other adverse conditions or extenuating circumstances basically on a highway, or unusual traffic or unusual road conditions. That's what classifies as the ability to use adverse conditions. But what you need to remember here is what it also says in there is that if the dispatcher or the driver knew that there was a forecasted situation and it was either known by either one of them, that adverse conditions may not be allowed at a check. Now, it says it's up to 2 hours, right? But you're not supposed to pass your driving time within the 14th hour after you come on duty. That's sometimes people think that they get an extra gift there, okay? But that's to get to safe haven. So when you look at interpretations and you look at the way this is used, this is really used to get to a safe haven. So it doesn't mean use up all 2 hours. Get yourself to a safe place. That's how my interactions and how I think enforcement interprets it. But I wanted to give you this one because it seemed that we must have had 5 questions on this from the last seminar. So one other thing that they added, no, I think the good thing is we have yard moves. The one thing that's also in there is the beginning of drive is very specific and it was tightened up. So maybe the yard you move takes care of moving equipment and jockeying around the yard. But once you're in a drive status, and that's really defined as quote unquote the only auto on duty, the motion will be achieved when the vehicle reaches a maximum of 5 miles per hour. So at that point, you're now in drive. There's nowhere in that, the way they worded it, to detect motion of no time duration, nor is there any distance consideration to that. So when you hit 5 miles an hour, we're supposed to measure that drive has begun. So that's what we have for today. We didn't want to cover too much else. We wanted to cover the questions that were presented, and I believe we still have some time left to answer some questions if they're there. And want to remind people that we'll continue to post information to eldfax.com related to the mandate, and I'll be watching the schedule very tightly now through September especially, and we'll keep posting more information as we go through this. So if we'd like to go to some questions, I'd love to do that.
Great. Thank you so much, Tom. So I will jump right into everyone's questions now. We'll get to as many as we can. One question that came in is, does the adverse conditions rule apply to the 8 hours part of driving?
Well, okay. Let me try and rephrase that to see if I understand it correctly. So the 8-hour part of driving, there's 11-hour drive time, right, in your day. Not sure exactly what you mean by the 8-hour drive time. You can't have that extended drive period to go past the 14 duty hours. And I may not be answering the question specifically, but if you're referring to your 8-hour of continuous on duty to take a break, maybe that's where you're going with that. But I'm not sure I understand of the pure 8 hours of drive time. Okay.
Thank you, Tom. We'll follow up with that person and get clarification later. There are a couple questions about the adverse conditions again. One of them is there a current method to mark a log for adverse conditions?
We in both products, we allow marking that you took them on a remark basis, so you can see at what point you started to do them. In one of the products, we make it a little tighter to try and measure the 2 hours so that you can get an alert when you hit the 2-hour mark of being in adverse conditions. But again, you don't get to drive beyond that 14th hour, or you'll get a 14-hour violation.
Okay, thank you. And this person wrote, is there really a safe haven clause? I thought this only related to hazardous materials.
It's there, and I took a little liberty there. It's not really a safe haven clause per se, but it refers to the fact that it gives you up to that amount of time to get to a safe area.
Okay, thank you. This question is, we put ELDs in all trucks because divisions swap trucks. How soon will we see the short haul hours of service?
In the product, I would have to get back and I'll get whoever asked that question and get specifics, but I think it will be in the next release on the MCP, and I don't have that date right in front of me now because we're updating some roadmap. If it's in the XRS product, that was released last fall.
Okay, thank you. This question is, if an OTR has a day of short haul exemption, do those hours apply toward the 78 on his E-log? If not, does he need to record something other than his time clock hours recorded in the OBC?
Right, hit me with that one more time. That's a little
Sure.
layered there.
Okay, we'll do the first part. If an OTR has a day of short haul exemption, do those hours apply toward the 70/8
Yes.
on his E-log?
Yes. Let me hit short haul. What doesn't change? When you read these regulations and exemptions, okay, what the exemption says is what you can do. If it doesn't say that in the exemption, right, which it doesn't refer to, you still have to specify whether that driver is going to be on a 60-hour or 70-hour week, and you still don't get more than 11 hours of drive time. Those things are not defined in the short haul exemption. So the answer is, if an over-the-road driver did a short haul day for 12 hours of on-duty time, right, then that would be counted against the 60 or 70, whatever rule set the carrier applied to that driver. What's the next part?
The next part was if not, so.
No, the answer is yes, it
answer
does.
is yes. Okay. I'm going through the questions here. We've got a lot of what ifs here and very specific circumstances. I'm trying to pick one that might be good.
Well, here's one. What about yard moves? What happens when the vehicle is moved by a yard maintenance when you are off duty and forgot to log out of the system? Usually I would suggest this with the systems that we're aware of, ours. If the driver comes in and logs into the system, right, then the log data gets synchronized and that driver is now in their logs. So that I don't think this would affect the yard person not logging out. It won't affect that driver. To answer that.
Okay, thank you. Here's a what if. If a driver has a steady run from, say, New Jersey to North Carolina, lays 10 hours and returns to New Jersey, can he use the 16-hour exemption?
Not only if they don't exceed 12-hour duty. Like if it's a constant run and it's position A to position B and back, they have to end the day where they started. So if they're not ending the day when they started, then they can't use a 16-hour big day because they have to return to the same terminal. And the 5 previous days have to be returned to the starting location. So I guess my answer to you would be no.
Okay, thank you. This person wrote, I was understanding that we would need all drivers on an EOBR before the rule is published in September. Do we have until 2017 to still install EOBRs versus ELDs?
Yeah, yes. The way the timeline is, and I know this stuff can get a little bit confusing, is let me go over the timeline verbally. Well, wait a minute. Maybe I can go backwards. All right, so if you look at the timeline, if everybody's there to can see this, look at the darker blue line, right? So this is simulated now in what we know. It's not necessarily gospel, but you can put an EOBRD in up until October of 2017 and then use it 2 years more as it's proposed. That's not the final, but as it's proposed for 2 years more up till October 2019. Now, if you do not put anything in before October 2017, EOBRD or ELD compliant device, you have to put in an ELD within that cycle. You can't go forward after October, right, without an ELD. Because that's 2 years for a compliance state. That's what that's defined as. And that goes all the way back to when MAP 21 was published.
Okay, thank you for going over that timeline again. This question is, when a driver who uses a ferry service that lasts a total of 3 hours, do those 3 hours go to on-duty or off-duty?
Repeat that one more time, please.
Sure. When a driver uses a ferry service that lasts a total of 3 hours,
that's on-duty time. The ferry service would be on duty time because they still are with the vehicle and they're working for the carrier.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, it could be off duty, but if it's off duty, it applies against total duty for the day. It doesn't apply against total duty for the week.
Okay. Here's another situational question. What should you do if you're at a location to pick up or deliver and they arrive early, the location is closed? They park and start their 10-hour break but are asked to move their truck out of the way and they are 8 hours into their 10-hour break. If you move that truck, will it ruin the 8 hours already done? What can we do in this situation?
That's hard to answer because in that situation, it's going to be situation by situation. You know, if you're able to move the vehicle under the new rule in less than 5 miles, I'm not sure how we would totally treat that because we have to make modifications to the product for the mandate. But if you hit the 8 hours, you'd have 8 consecutive hours off, and if you start to move the vehicle and it goes into drive, then that's the end of that cycle. And I know this happens to people probably every day where driver is asked, wants to take a break or needs to take a break and are asked to move the vehicle. What's it going to do to them? The best comment I would make there is, to make sure there's remarks inserted in the system so that somebody understands what the situation was. I mean, I don't think enforcement is always trying to do everything, to granularity that's going to hurt people. They're looking for things that are blatant, So that's the best way I can answer because there's no cast in concrete answer to that.
Thank you, Tom. I think we had this question in one of the previous webinars, but does the safety department of each company set the rules for their personal conveyance?
Well, that's an allowance by the carrier. They can say, I want my vehicles to be able to be used, or I want my drivers to use personal conveyance, or don't use personal conveyance. Yeah, it's safety managers that set that, because basically, if you look at the rules, the carrier is responsible for setting the rule sets that the driver uses, whether they're on a 60, a 70, or oil field, or short haul. That's how that works. So, and that's how the regulation is specified. So my suggestion is the safety department would say you can use the vehicles for personal conveyance, or you use my trucks for non-personal. You can't use them for personal conveyance. That's up to the safety managers and the carrier.
Okay, thank you, Tom. This one is, I am an engineer and OEM. At an OEM, our product is a yard truck and is used by multiple drivers throughout the day, sometimes for 24 hours per day. How will the drivers be inputted into the system? Some drivers do not need CDLs as they do not go, onto the
So they don't go on public roads.
On the highway, okay, yeah.
Right. So if those drivers are just on private property, I mean, you can have them log in and just track movement. But if they don't need to have a CDL and you're not on private property and you're not going to the roadbed, that's where the new regulation allows a thing called yard move. So they can do that. But if you touch any public access road, then you have to have a CDL and you have to be able to log in and get your hours recorded.
Thanks, Tom. So short haul, yard, or over the road, when the driver forgets to log out and someone drives the truck, what is the correct method to move this drive time?
So somebody drove the truck. Now, read that to me one more time. I'm trying.
Sure. So short haul, yard, or over the road, when the driver forgets to log out and someone drives the truck, what is the correct method to move this drive time?
Well, you can use the standard edit function, and as long as you put the comments and as to why you were changing this, that can be done in the back office editor. Now, in the new regulations, it'll have to be presented to the driver that you did that in their log.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Going back to the glossary, just to make sure everyone's clear, we got this question: what is the difference between EOBRD and EOBR?
EOBRD is the actual designation under 49 CFR 395.15, which is the current regulation in place. All right? Conceptually and technically, there's no difference between an EOBR and an EOBRD. Where the term for electronic onboard recording device came from was back in 2010, FMCSA released a regulation called 395.16. 395.16 was difficult to be implemented and couldn't be. So that term only really existed at that time, but the industry and many people grabbed EOBRD as a term to make it synonymous with fleet management systems and logging devices, when in fact there's fleet management systems that may or may not be using logging, but an EOBRD is the actual designation that technically is the FMCSA designation for what's in the marketplace right now. And EOBRD was a term that came out and stuck for a while, and it was very short-lived. But conceptually, it's the same thing.
Thank you for clarifying. This question is, has there been talk about exceptions for drive-away companies that cannot connect anything to a truck?
There actually had been some discussions about drive-away, and it's been in two different ways. One has been to have a system installed because you still have to account for some hours. Some drive-aways could actually classify as short haul. Some drive-aways can't, because it depends on where they're delivering the vehicles and how far they have to go. But there had been some recommendations in the SMPRM on how to address driveway operations, but that is yet to be seen in the final reg.
Thank you. What would happen if a driver was at a customer getting unloaded and hit his 14 and was made to go off the property, but there was no place to park on the street?
Well, that goes along the lines with what previous questions we had about being there and breaking your 8 hours. It's basically in the same realm. This is where I would just make sure that there are very specific comments in there. And hopefully you can find a position that's, in a very short distance away from that shipper or that consignee, and make remarks and comments in the logs. Because sometimes I've heard enforcement say, 14 hours is 14 hours, right? So that there's other considerations with that. So sometimes you have to help with planning also.
Thank you. Is there a solution for mechanical engines?
No, there is not yet. They've asked for comments. Many of us, the suppliers, I know I gave some specific comments on how to handle mechanical engines. There would be a cost involved, but it may not be able to record all the information required by the proposed regulation, such as engine hours and things of this nature. There are devices out there that you can install in a mechanical engine that will supply road time and miles driven and make it think that it was a 1939 engine. But they didn't come up with hard and fast methods or what they would allow a mechanical engine to not record, which I suspect some of that may come in the final rule.
Thanks, Tom. Do ELDs only address interstate travel, not interstate as just Texas, for example, or any other state?
Well, it depends on your supplier. On the XRS and the Omnitrax products, okay, we address many of the California rule sets, the Texas rule sets, North Carolina, many of the state rule sets, some of them in Florida. I mean, Texas has a Texas oil field rule and the Texas intrastate. There's a California hazmat rule, California intrastate rule. So those are questions that we posed to FMCSA about harmonization between federal rules and state rules, because we make sure that when you're on state rules and you convert to federal, you have to comprehend that you're on federal rules for 7 days before you can convert back to state. So the answer is yes, we do them, but there's not an actual requirement in the SNPRM. The SNPRM only addresses federal rules. But us as suppliers, we have to be able to be flexible enough to address some of the state and the federal, as well as Canada, by the way.
Thanks, Tom. How does the short haul exemption apply to cement haulers who report at Site A, drive to work Site B, work a full day, and do not drive again until coming back to Site A, but it is after 12 hours at that point?
Well, if it's after 12 hours, you already broke the exemption. Okay? I mean, there's construction rules that give a 24-hour reset, but you have to follow a different rule set. I would not think that in the way you described your example that you would be able to use short haul being over and not returning to the site until after the 12th hour. Those two things by themselves would tell me that you need to be on an 11, 14, or 60, 70-hour rule set standard federal, if that's the way your business runs.
Thank you, Tom. Are there any updates that will allow an alert to headquarters when an EOBR is disconnected from the truck, for example, the driver disconnecting the recording device? We have talked periodically about a heartbeat, but at this time we did this in some task force at ATA some years ago. I don't know that we have it other than when the thing gets reconnected, the data can be looked at and you can understand that it was dormant for some period of time. All right, thank you so much, Tom. We are out of time now, so we are going to wrap things up. We did receive a lot of questions specifically related to Omnitrax XRS products, and we will be following up with everyone who asked those questions, so look out for some emails from us. So thank you again, Tom, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Please stay tuned for more webinars on the ELD mandate. As Tom mentioned, check out eldfacts.com to stay updated on the latest. So thank you and have a great day.